Hey everyone, today I want to talk to you about teleconverters, what they are, how they work, what the pros and cons are, and what the alternatives are. So teleconverters, they come in a bunch of different brands. Canon and Nikon make their own, but there's third-party manufacturers as well. They feel like they're just a big solid piece of glass, but they're actually more complex than that. The Nikon 17, for example, has 7 elements in 4 different groups. So it's not as simple, just a single piece of glass.
Note on this model that the element sticks out, so it doesn't fit all lenses. Make sure you check the compatibility list.
There's several, hey ladies, there's several pros and cons to using these guys compared to some of the others. So let's take a couple of test shots and talk them through. Now, subject, she'll do just fine. Okay, so the primary reason you would get a teleconverter is it gives you extra range. The main variants they come in are a 1.4, 1.7 or 2-time extender. So that's basically the multiplication ratio you get on your lens. But it's different to going from like a full frame to a crop sensor. This keeps the full frame coverage of your lens and it basically acts as just a magnifying glass. But it does have a side effect of it steals some light. So a 1.4 steals a full stop of light and gives you a 1.4 time extension. So if you're shooting on a 200mm lens, then it becomes a 280. 1.7 gives you a 1.7 ratio, but it takes 1.5 stops of light, and a 2-time obviously takes 2 times and it steals 2 stops of light. But there's a few different things to think about there. If you're in a weird patchy dappled light situation like me and you're trying to act like creepy paparazzi to shoot the pretty girl you just saw, there's times where you'll wish that you had more focal length. There at 200mm with my 70-200, that's as close as I can get. By popping on this guy, it gives me a 1.7 time multiplication. So it goes from being a 70-200 to a 119 to 340. Does that sound right? But it'll steal 1.5 stops of light. So it goes from being an f2.8 to an f4.8.
It's worth noting that Lightroom does recognize it using a teleconverter, and it'll update the aperture and focal length to reflect that.
Running through some of the pros and cons of these guys. The biggest and most obvious pro is it does give you that extra reach. A big con though is it does add a fair bit of weight and size. If you're already carrying a big lens, having that extra bit changes the whole balance. That's something you want to consider. The other thing is, with all of that extra glass thrown in there, there's more pieces of glass in the optical system. If it's not top quality, there's a chance that it's going to introduce flare and ghosting and all of those problems that you may have just bought a premium lens to avoid. Oh, I think she spotted me. So apart from the chance of degrading your image in that way, it also just has the chance of softening your image. I personally tested the 1.47 and 2 before choosing the 1.7, and I was comfortable with the amount of image degradation. One thing you want to keep in mind, the focal length rule of keeping your hand holding speed about the same as your focal length is in effect here. So you're going to need to be more careful with your hand holding. Any shake is going to be more pronounced with the extended zoom. Another potential downside is that it may make your focus slower. It really depends on your lens and camera combination, but it's certainly not going to improve it. It may slow things down slightly or considerably. I haven't found too much using a high-end Nikon camera and high-end body. Of course, the fact that it is dropping the amount of light getting to your sensor, that will make any camera struggle a little bit more, especially in low light situations. You've only got 4.8 to play with instead of 2.8. Pluses, so obviously you get a longer lens for not that much extra money. If I wanted to buy a 340mm 4.8 with top quality glass, it doesn't exist, but it would cost quite a bit. For example, if you owned a 200mm f2.8, if you got the 1.4 teleconverter, you could turn that into a 280 f4 at any time, rather than having the 200 and a 300mm lens. Another cool thing is, whilst it does reduce the amount of light getting to the sensor, it doesn't have the other effect of your aperture in that it doesn't affect the depth of field in that way. The aperture opening of your lens isn't changing, so your depth of field is going to remain largely the same. In terms of alternatives, you could always, on a full frame camera, turn it on to a crop mode and just take the central part, or after you've taken the shot, you could crop the image yourself. Two things on that. Obvious one, you lose resolution doing it that way, and this way you keep using all of the resolution you have. And if you do it in post, that's a whole nother step added to your process. So this way it's all in camera as it was captured. So let's get a sample with and without it.
First off, I'll grab 2 different images here, one that was shot with it and one without, and then let's open them up in Adobe Photoshop so we can compare them. Okay, so these are our two images. There's the one with teleconverter and there's the one without. Let's go in and look at 100% on her face. That's without, nice and crisp. And with it, you can see it's actually a bit soft. I went from 100th of a second to a 40th and it's gone blurry. So let's find a sharper one to compare. Okay, so comparing them here on fast forward, I found that at least a third of them weren't pin sharp. I didn't have my auto ISO on, so my shutter speed just dropped right down and I was around a 40th of a second at 340 mil, which is just too slow. But here's one which is nice and sharp, so let's bring that into Photoshop and compare it. So it's glasses on, no teleconverter, glasses off with teleconverter. And comparing them head to head, looking at the lips primarily, I think that without it is definitely sharper, no surprises there. But we don't have the same focal length, we're not as close on her. So going in and zooming or increasing the size of the image without teleconverter by 170% makes that image bigger. Then we can crop into that center section and have the same resolution effectively and get as close to her as we do with the teleconverter. There's different ways you could do this, but letting Photoshop do the algorithms to try and increase the image size as best it can is probably the closest way. Then we can compare them again at full crop and see how's the image quality if you were to do it in post to get in just as close and keep the resolution, or doing it with the teleconverter. There we go without and then zoomed, and there we are with the teleconverter. Look, there's differences in the image. I don't think it's an appreciable big difference, to be perfectly honest. You know, there was slightly different lighting. We were shooting outdoors in a real, how we actually shoot, and I don't think there's a huge difference. Just one is all done in camera and you don't have to go through this process. The other one, you'd have to go in and batch edit them in Photoshop if you did want to retain the full resolution. Of course, at 36 megapixel on a D800, you've got resolution to burn if you wanted to just crop in.
So another thing you really need to keep in mind when you're comparing the image quality, using it and not using it, is if you're using a camera where high ISO is really degrading the image performance, which arguably is all of them, but more so on the lower end cameras, losing that extra stop and a half of light is going to push you to a higher ISO, and you have to factor that into the image degradation as well. So
Will you take a photo for me?
Thanks guys, I got to go. Leave me your questions, comments, bye.
You can check out my 70 to 200 comparison between the Nikon, Tamron and Canon here. And if you're interested, you can see this video comparing teleconverters to extension tubes. Cheers, guys.